The R5 is out, but unfortunately, all you really hear about is the video stuff and the overheating. So if you're like a photographer like me and you're looking to pick up the R5 for stills only, you've probably felt a little left out. I'm going to change that in this video. In this one, we're going to talk about the R5 in comparison to the R. What up YouTube, Anthony here. If you've been following my videos, you know that I pre-ordered the R5 and thankfully I can say I got one in. I've had it for a few days now and I've been doing some testing. I've had a few photo shoots, and so I thought it was important to do this video. Unfortunately, most of the reviews and the videos that you're seeing currently all deal with the video stuff and the overheating. And although I think Canon's marketing is a big reason why they're dealing with what they're dealing with now, I know there are a lot of people out there like me that are looking to purchase the R5 for stills only. I've been shooting professionally for a long time and I've never done any video work, and I had no intent to do any video work with the R5, at least not immediately. So I wasn't really concerned about the video features or the problems that people are having with them. So I really wanted to do a video that dealt with the photography side of the R5. And to go further, I wanted to compare that with the R, because I'm sure there's people out there that own the R and they're wondering, is it a worthwhile upgrade? And so we're going to touch on that. Before I get into it, I want to say I do have chapters in this video, so that way if there's something specific that you want to know about, you can just click to that, or you can watch the whole thing through. I also want to say, for all of my shooting that I've done thus far and all of my testing, I have used EF lenses because I don't own any RF glass. I don't shoot with the R professionally, and because of that, I haven't felt that it was important or made sense to invest in RF glass because it's expensive. So I did use EF glass for that. I can say the results have still been very good. I think the one thing that Canon really knocked out the park when they introduced the R and the RP was the RF to EF adapter. I think it works phenomenal. But that being said, I do think if you had RF glass, I think the results would be even better. So in everything that I'm going to talk about, I really am looking at the R5 in comparison to the R. I've done, a lot of testing, and we're going to jump right into that now. So the first thing I want to talk about is the body, and I'm not going to get into all the details on the buttons and the weight and the size and all that stuff. I'm sure you've watched videos or you could read the spec. I don't want to bore you with that, but I do want to talk about how it feels in the hand. Now, I have bigger hands. The R5, the grip, the front grip is thicker than the R. So for me, it definitely feels better in the hand than the R. The R by no means feels uncomfortable. I enjoy holding the R. It fits in my hand just fine. But the R5, with it having the thicker grip, it does fit in my hand a little bit better. Outside of that, ergonomically, it really is about the same. I mean, obviously there's some different buttons. You have the joystick and the dial and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the camera body itself, it really does feel the same. So if you're comfortable with the R, if you upgrade it to the R5, I think it would feel just as comfortable. Unless you had really small hands, then the thicker grip could pose somewhat of a problem. But outside of that, there's really not much difference in the body. Okay, moving on to the EVF. I am not a fan of EVF. I've never been a fan of EVFs. I'm still not a fan of EVFs, but I can tell you the EVF in the R5 is phenomenal. And looking at this thing, it makes me want to look at the A7S III whenever it comes out, because the resolution in that thing is almost double what the R5 is. And the R5, the EVF, it is just a fantastically clear EVF. I mean, when you're looking through that thing, when the ambient kind of matches the exposure that you're looking at through the EVF, it really does look like you're looking through an optical viewfinder. It really does. In comparison to the R, there is a noticeable difference. I think the R EVF for me is really good. Now, keep in mind, I don't own other cameras. I'm not a camera reviewer. I don't get other cameras to compare to the gear that I have. So I don't know what other EVFs look like. The R may pale in comparison to other people, so I'm not looking to do these comparisons to what else is out there. There may be things better, but I really just want to stick to these two cameras. So there is a noticeable difference in the EVF between the two cameras, but I don't think that the R was bad. So I don't think that there would have been any reason to update the R to the R5 for the EVF. What I will point out, and I think something that people will be very happy about, the R definitely has a lag in the EVF. Even when you have image review turned off, when you take that image, there is a brief lag. And I'm not exactly sure why that was, but there is a brief lag in the R. I was not able to find any lagging in the R5. I did a lot of different shots and I would shoot and move. I was not able to see that. And I have the R5 is, I've had it in the 60 frame per second mode the entire time. I've not shot with it really too much in the 120. So in the 60 frame per second, I'm not seeing any lag in the EVF after taking a shot. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is file sizes and storage media. And I have my laptop here to make sure that I don't miss anything. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm looking at. The average file size on the R5 with the 45 megapixel, I found to be somewhere around 50 megs. Now, of course, the file size is contingent upon a lot of things, what you're shooting, the dynamic range, ISO, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of variances in the size that you get, but on average, about 50 megs. Now, when I was doing some high ISO testing, they were getting up into the 75, 80 meg a piece. So the files obviously are going to be bigger than what they are on the R. I think I average about 35 megs or so on the R. So obviously you're going to have more storage that you're going to need if you move to the R, but storage is cheap. It's really not a big deal. Now, what I did notice is that in using UHS-1 cards, the R5 struggles big time. Now, I've got some CF Express cards and some US2 cards on order. I've not really had those before now because I haven't needed them. I don't really do a lot of continuous shooting, so it's never been a problem in any of the cameras that I've owned. But with the R5 and the file size, those cards are definitely inadequate. And I have, the SanDisk Extreme Pros, and they're 90 megasecond cards, and it definitely lags. Now, I can do continuous shooting, but it definitely takes a little time to get those files written to the card. At one point, I think I did about a 3-second burst, and it took roughly about 10 seconds before the red light went off to say that all the files are written. Now, it's not to say that I couldn't keep shooting. I still had buffer room, so the buffer in the camera hadn't filled up. But it still takes time to write to the card, and it probably wouldn't have taken much longer for me to fill that buffer up because the card just couldn't keep up. So if you're going to move to the R5, if you don't have CF Express cards and US2 cards, you're really going to have to get them. You really need a CF Express card, especially if you want to have redundancy and have the benefit of having the dual card slot. So you're going to have to pick up some cards regardless, and they're not cheap. So if you're going to invest in the R5, you need to invest some extra money to be able to pick up that storage media as well. It's just the nature of it. Okay, moving on to battery life. I know that has been something that has been a hot topic. I believe Canon, in their spec sheet, they said that you would get 320 images per charge. Now, in all of the testing that I've done with this, I've had one battery in here. I know I have the grip on both cameras, but in all my testing, I just put one battery in because I just wanted to only use that one battery. And they're both LP E6N batteries. They are not the R5. I'm not using the higher capacity battery that came with the camera. I really wanted to keep them consistent. And so in all of the testing, I did 383 stills, and I did 8 minutes and 20 seconds of video. I had the IS on the 70-200, and the battery is at 36%. So I do think that Canon spec sheet is very, very conservative, and I understand that it really has to be that way, because if you're not and then people don't get the number, then we have, Overheat Gate version 2. So I'm happy to report that I think you will get a lot more than 320 shots. Now, keep in mind, that's really going to be contingent upon your settings. I have this set to not have live view on the screen, so I only use the EVF and I just had the info on the screen. Also have the EVF at 60 frames per second versus the 120 frames per second. The IBIS is still working. So depending upon your settings and how you're shooting, I wasn't doing a ton of continuous shooting. I wasn't having to do a lot of tracking. So obviously that's going to tax it a little more. So maybe that would bring the battery down. But if you're just the average portrait shooter or someone that's just taking pictures in a normal setting, I think you're going to get well past the 320 frames that they're saying. And I mean, I even did this with high ISO shots that, again, those files were large, and I still have some battery left. So I think they're very conservative. I think you'll be happy with it. Up next, let's talk about autofocus. And man, the autofocus on the R5 is phenomenal. Let me just preface with that right now. As a R shooter, having the eye autofocus was fantastic in the R, but the reality is, and I'm a Canon guy, I've always been a Canon guy, but I can admit the reality is the eye autofocus in the R was good, but it was never great. Sony really blew this out the water. Even with the new firmware, the R simply just wasn't in the same league as some of the other brands. And so, that was a big thing that I was looking for with the R5. They had really touted this Mark II version of the DPAF, and I really wanted to see if it was that much better, because although I enjoy shooting with the R and the eye autofocus is good, there's just a lot of times where you really have to kind of help the camera figure out what it wants to focus on. And so using the R5, I could tell you the autofocus is significantly better than the R. If you were looking to upgrade just for the autofocus, that alone, I would say upgrading to the R would be worth it. It tracks the subject phenomenally. It locates the eye quickly. The subject can be very small in the scene and it still manages to find the eye, where the R just really struggles with even finding the face at all, let alone the eye. The subject moving around in the scene, it tracks it extremely well. All in all, in every aspect of tracking and eye autofocus, the R5, I would go as far as saying it is significantly better. There were just a lot of times in the testing where the R just simply couldn't find the person, and the R5 had no problem. Rarely did I have to touch on the screen to get the R5 to be able to find the subject and then track it. Even when they moved out of the frame and came back into the frame, the R5 was able to pick that up without a problem, where the R, it struggled big time. And in some of the testing, I didn't refocus the R because I wanted to see if it would be able to pick it up. And in most cases, it didn't find the person. Now, let me say, just so that way both cameras, I had them set to the factory setting of all of the autofocus options. I didn't tweak anything, change anything. I have done that with the R, but I set it back to the factory because I really wanted to see how they performed without any tweaking. I wanted it to be an apples to apples comparison. So all of the autofocus settings were set to the factory settings. Now, in terms of the frames per second, the R5 is obviously marketed as having 12 frame mechanical, 20 EVF. Okay, and so the thing about that, obviously that is like best case scenario, and there's only certain EF lenses that are compatible with achieving 12 frame per second, 20 frame per second electronic. And I'll put the little spec sheet that's in the advanced user guide that explains all basically the asterisks, the caveats. The 7200 Mark II version is not one that is on the list to be able to achieve 12 frames per second. So I wasn't anticipating getting that. But what I can say is that I was able to achieve 9 to 10 frames per second, even though I was only at 500th of a second on the shutter. So in the Canon, in the user guide, it says to be able to get to 12, you need to have 1/1000th of a second at least. And so I was able to get on average 9 to 10 frames per second, whereas on the R, in the same conditions when I was doing the testing, I was averaging about 4 to 5 frames per second. So you can definitely estimate in a real world, and again, there's a lot of factors that go into you achieving the 12 frames per second. But on average, you can expect to get double the frame rate going to the R5 from the R. And I think that's pretty significant because the R was very disappointing in the frame per second. It only had 8, and then once you went down to the servo, then it dropped even more. And then if you had the tracking, all that things, it just kept dropping down to you were getting 3 frames per second. So the R5 was able to achieve the 9 to 10 with all of those things in place. So that's fantastic. So between having the amazing autofocus that's significantly better than the R and getting double the frame rate, the autofocus piece of this camera is one of the best things for a stills photographer. It is just phenomenal, and you can get that frame rate. It's just great. I absolutely love the R5's autofocus. If you've been watching any videos and people have been saying it's one of the best eye tracking autofocuses that they've seen, I'm telling you, believe it. Now, again, I haven't used all the other brands, but in using the R and seeing where the R5 has come, it is spectacular. I'm super excited about this autofocus. In terms of image quality, I found the R5 to be fantastic. Obviously, having the 45 megapixels is fantastic, but that really comes more into play with respect to cropping. I mean, the R is 30 megapixels, so that's nothing to be shy about. So between the two, what I found, and I have a lot more testing to do on image quality. I need to go out and do some more real world stuff. I did more of in studio type stuff with the flash and with my mannequin. But what I found, to be quite frank and honest, was that there wasn't a huge difference in the image quality between the two cameras. They really were comparable. Now, I understand in doing in studio and using a flash that I'm getting consistent light, so it's not necessarily true representation of the differences, but I do feel that if the R was significantly lower in terms of image quality to the R5, you would see that regardless of the circumstances that you're shooting under. But I am going to do more tests. Now, what I did notice and what I did find interesting was that the R5 was consistently 2/3 stops darker than the R. And so I know with the more megapixels, the pixels are smaller, so they absorb less light. Maybe that is why. I don't know why. I don't have an explanation. I tried to look it up and I couldn't find an answer, but I consistently had a 2/3 stop darker image on the R5. And when I was doing the testing, one of the benefits of shooting in studio and using a flash is that I was able to keep the settings consistent and exactly the same. So I did all of the shots with the R first. I wrote all of those settings down, including the flash power. And then I used the same exact lens that I used on the R, put that on the R5, and took the same exact shots with all the settings that I used with the R. And so when I noticed it, in camera, I was thinking, it was just the JPEG preview that you see, and maybe there was just a difference. Although the settings were the same in both, I set the picture profile exactly the same in both. I thought maybe there was just a difference in how the R5 rendered it on the screen. But once I pulled it into the computer, I noticed that the R5 images were consistently 2/3 stops underexposed. Now, obviously, or maybe you don't know, Lightroom Classic does not yet support the raw files from the R5. So I did have to convert this to a DNG. So to keep things consistent, I also converted the R files to a DNG as well. So perhaps there's something with that conversion or how Lightroom Classic is processing the DNG files. Maybe there's some sort of difference there. I'm not exactly sure. I can't really explain that, but I definitely can say that I was able to get that consistently. There was a difference. If you have any information on that, or if I'm missing something, please educate me on that, because it's definitely left me puzzled, and it's not often that I'm puzzled when it comes to photography and camera stuff. So if you know anything on that, definitely let me know. I will be doing a lot more testing. I put some examples up as I was explaining this, but again, I'm going to do more, so no need to blow up the comments. Just trust me when I say the image quality between the two is very comparable. I don't think that the R5 is light years better than the R. So if you're happy with the image quality that you're getting from the R, going up to the R5 is not going to substantially make that better. And it could have been the lens that I was using. Obviously the 70-200 Mark II lenses are very good. And so maybe if you were using a cheaper lens or something that wasn't as high quality, maybe you would see a bigger difference between the two. But in all of the testing that I've done, even in the testing that I was doing to test the autofocus and that sort of thing, I really didn't see where the R was significantly better with respect to image quality than the R5. So I do find them to be pretty comparable. Okay, in terms of dynamic range, I'll be honest in saying I am not an expert of how to really test dynamic range. I know there's tools and that sort of thing. That's really not my area of expertise. I could say I took some images of some landscape to try to play around with bringing down the highlights and exposing the shadows to see what I was able to get. And, I really saw the same thing with that as I did with the image quality. I really didn't see the R5 significantly better or worse than the R. So to me, in what I've seen thus far, the image quality and the performance of the sensor in terms of dynamic range seems to be very comparable to what the R is. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. I know the R camera really lagged behind other sensors, but I think from a Canon perspective, they have been very consistent to a fault. And so I don't know that I was expecting light years better in the R5 from the R. I know Canon is saying that there was a one-stop dynamic range improvement, but we all know what the manufacturer says and what the real world results are normally not consistent, and it's normally less than what they advertise. So, I won't sit here and say that I'm a pro at doing dynamic range. I'm not very good at knowing how to test that and being able to bring anything to say one way or another that the R5 does indeed provide that extra dynamic range. I'm going to do some research to see how I can test that, and I'll do a future video to test that better. But from what I did do in terms of shadow recovery and highlight recovery, I honestly didn't see a huge difference between the two cameras. So again, in terms of image quality and dynamic range, to me, they're very comparable. The R5 might slightly be better, but is it enough to upgrade? Absolutely not. If the image quality and the dynamic range performance that you're getting in the R is sufficient for you, it's not lacking for you, there would be no reason to jump to the R5 in hopes that you're going to see a dramatic increase. I just haven't seen that. But again, in terms of dynamic range, I know that is a hot topic. I'm going to do research to figure out how to test that better. So do not hold this with a lot of weight. This was just, I tested something real quick just to see. I'm going to do more testing on the dynamic range to see if the R5 is indeed significantly better. In terms of ISO performance, this is where I did find that the R5 performed moderately better than the R. The one thing that I really noticed, especially when you start to get into the higher ISO values, is that to me and to my eye, I find the noise in the R5 to be more refined. It's more clean. It's more smooth. And I'm putting some stuff on the screen so that way you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. And hopefully you can see it if you're looking on your phone or anything like that. But the amount of noise I've found to be somewhat comparable between the two cameras, but the quality of the noise I found to be better and more pleasing on the R5. Now, what I can say is that the R5 in terms of ISO performance is fantastic. You really can push the ISO on this camera and you can still get relatively clean images. I pushed this all the way up to 51,200. And although you can see the noise at that ISO level, I think they're still astoundingly usable. I think both of these cameras are light years better than some of the older DSLRs in terms of ISO performance, and the R5 is definitely not going to let you down in that case. Now, I do want to do more testing for for the high ISO and do different scenes, because again, I did a lot of things in a studio session just to be able to show a consistent comparison between the two cameras. But I do want to go out and do a little bit more of a practical and real world testing of darker scenes to I really have to push that ISO to see what kind of stuff we're getting. I know for people who use the R for like astrophotography at nighttime, they had a lot of banding in the shadows. And I simply don't think I'm going to be able to see that testing in a studio type session. But and what I was able to do, I came away very, very, very impressed with how well the R5 works in terms of ISO performance. It's just fantastic. You can have this camera and not be afraid to push those values up. You're still going to be able to get images that are clean. And I didn't even run any of my images through any type of noise reduction, and you can see in looking at these images that you still have detail there. If you look at the eyelashes and things, there's still a lot of detail there, even though the ISO values are so high and there's noise there. So I think both of these cameras perform very well, but I definitely have to give a nod to the R5. I think the quality of that noise is much more appealing, much more pleasing. And between those two, if you were upgrading to the R5, I think you would be very happy with the ISO performance of this camera. Okay, moving on to the image stabilization, and that has been something that has been welcome for us Canon shooters. I have a lot of lenses that I love to shoot with that doesn't have IS, and although I haven't really found myself in situations to where I really need to shoot slower shutter speeds to where IS would be that much of a difference, it is a nice thing to have when you have it. And so in testing the IBIS on the i5 or on the R5, the IBIS is fantastic. It really does work extremely well. I don't know how to test if it's the 8 stops that they say you can get, but I was able to shoot at 1/10 of a second, and I was shooting a living subject, and that image was tack sharp at 1/10 of a second. You try to hold still, but it's not easy. And that was shooting at f1.4, and I was able to get that tack sharp. So that was impressive to me. Obviously the R does not have in-body image stabilization. So if that's something that you want, upgrading to the R5 would be a no-brainer. What I can say is that I think it is a worthwhile tool to have. In comparing the IS on just the lens on the R versus having the IS with the IBIS, the R5 footage and the ability to handhold it is phenomenal. It really is. It is not a gimmick. Again, I don't know if it's the 8 stops that they claim, but what I can tell you is that it is an extremely noticeable difference between the steadiness of what you see with the R5 versus the R. It is just an incredible tool. I think it really opens up the ability to be able to do low light shooting and come away with images that are much more tack sharp. And when you combine the IBIS with the excellent ISO performance, the two together makes this an extremely valuable tool for wedding and event photographers. The ability to be able to use a slower shutter speed to let in more light and be able to pump up that ISO and know that you're still going to be able to come through with a tack sharp image with pleasing noise is amazing. Now, of course, when you're shooting at at lower shutter speeds, it effectively eliminates the camera shake, but it's obviously not going to get rid of motion blur. Okay, so if your subject is moving, you're not going to be able to freeze your subject just because you have IBIS. So if you're looking at that, or if you have this, keep in mind there are limitations when you're shooting at those lower shutter speeds. It's only managing the motion blur of the camera, or I'm sorry, the camera shake, and not the motion blur of the subject. So if your subject moves, obviously you're not going to come away with tack sharp images. But I can definitely tell you the IBIS is fantastic. Everything that you've heard about it is true. It is phenomenal. I am super excited to be able to have it in this camera. I shoot a lot of Sigma lenses, and to be able to now have some sort of IS with those lenses is fantastic. It really is great. One thing to note about the IS, there is an option in the menu. It's in the Shoot 7, the 7 of the Shoot menu. You are able to turn off IBIS when you have a lens attached to it that doesn't have IS. That option goes away when you attach a lens with IS. And I believe, and I kind of tested this, but I didn't have time to truly test. So I'll have to go back and check it to make sure. But I believe when you have a lens that's attached with IS, if you turn IS off of the lens, it turns IBIS off as well. I don't know that you're able to have IS off on the lens, but still have IS or IBIS on the camera. I don't know that for certain. Again, I got to test that. When I turned it off and I was doing some testing, it did seem like the IBIS was off as well, but I need to test that more. But what I can say with certainty is that when you attach a lens that in and of itself does not have IS at all, then you do have an option in the menu to be able to toggle the IBIS on and off. And there's also an option to have IBIS on all the time or just when you're doing a shot. And then there's also an option if the lens can't communicate with the camera that you can set the focal length. So that's just something to note. Again, I'll do more testing to see if turning IS off on the lens turns IBIS off as well, but you can at least turn it on and off if you have a lens that doesn't have IBIS. Not sure why you would turn it off, but you can. Maybe to save battery or something like that. So that is an option. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about is shooting after overheating. Now, of course, there's been a gazillion videos about overheating, and a question that I see a lot of people ask is, well, can you still shoot stills after it overheats? And you kind of get answers, but not really. So I knew for me, that was something I really wanted to test. Not that I do a lot of video and I'm concerned about overheating, but I did want to test that. Now, let me say first, I know there's been a lot of people that have been saying when the camera overheats, the camera doesn't feel hot. And I didn't find that to be the case at all. And I actually used my buddy's FLIR, FLIR. It's basically like a high-end thermal temperature reader type thing, some nerd type stuff. And so we did some temperature readings on the camera, and the camera definitely gets hot, and the camera behind the LCD screen was definitely warm to the touch. So it was a hot day yesterday when I recorded this stuff. I'm in Los Angeles. It was almost 100 degrees. So when we did the ambient check of the camera, the temperature was about ambient for the temperature outside. So we were reading 94 degrees. After I did about 6 minutes of 4K recording, that temperature went up to almost 101 degrees. And the back of the camera, again, if you pull the LCD out, the back of the camera was noticeably warmer, and it was noticeably warmer than the R. When I was doing that testing, I was recording both at the same time because I really wanted to compare the temperatures between the two. The R had not heated up. When we did the reading on the R5, when we were approaching 101, the R was still measuring at 94, and it did not feel warmer to the touch as the R5 did. So that's not to say that people that are saying the camera doesn't heat up is wrong. I just question if maybe they're not really touching everywhere on the camera to see if it's hot. For me, at least for my R5, the back of the camera behind the LCD was definitely noticeably warmer, and the FLIR temperature supported that as well. The camera itself was absolutely hotter in the R5 than it was for the R. So it does heat up. So I don't know that it necessarily is just a overly conservative thing that Canon has. The camera definitely felt warm behind the LCD. Everywhere else, I would agree, it wasn't warm at all. But behind the LCD screen, it absolutely was warmer. And again, the FLIR readings for sure confirm that. So anyway, getting back to it. Once the camera overheated, I was able to shoot stills no problem. I was able to do continuous shooting. There was no impact whatsoever in the ability to shoot after the camera overheated. I probably took another 50 or 60 shots just to see if there would be any issue. I did a quick burst to see if there was any issue in continuous, and I didn't encounter any problems at all. I didn't test any video stuff because I'm not a video guy, but stills wise, I was immediately able to turn the camera back on and start shooting. I did not have any problems at all. So I wouldn't think that there would be any issues. So if you are a stills person who does video here and there, if you do overheat the camera, I don't think that you will encounter any problems once it overheats to shoot stills. I would imagine maybe you could run into an issue if you were doing a lot of tracking and continuous shooting, you know, just one after the other of burst and shooting and all that. You know, you may possibly run into some issues. You know, I can't test every single scenario. And in a lot of the testing that I did, I tried to keep it consistent with my style of shooting, because although I'm presenting this to you on YouTube, I really needed to know for my own shooting how my tools work. So I really tried to keep things consistent with how I shoot. So I can't say that you would never encounter issues shooting stills after overheating. But I was able to immediately turn the camera back on and immediately start shooting stills without any problem. I was still getting the 9-10 frame per second that I had got earlier in the testing. I didn't see any degradation at all in the image quality. To me, the performance was exactly the same from a stills perspective as it was prior to me getting to the point of overheating the camera. So I wouldn't have any concern about it. If you get this, this would be something you would want to test to be more applicable to your style of shooting, just to make sure. But I would feel comfortable in saying I don't think you're going to encounter any problems shooting stills even after the camera overheats. But I will say the camera definitely gets hot. Even though people are saying it doesn't, it definitely warms up. Okay, so that wraps it up. Hopefully this was helpful. It has been fun and exciting testing these two cameras. I have to say, in conclusion, the R5 from a stills perspective, as you would have thought based on the specs on paper, it is a phenomenal camera. I am extremely excited about this camera. Again, the autofocus in this thing is amazing. The IBIS is great. The image quality is fantastic. The battery life I have found to be on par with what I've seen with the R. All in all, the R5 is just an incredible camera. And I think if you have the R and you're looking to upgrade to the R5, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, so this is nothing to argue about, I think the R5 is absolutely worth the upgrade from the R, even at the price point. Even with the video features being what they are, even with the overheating, if you are a still shooter and you are looking to upgrade from the R or from any other DSLR, or you're contemplating getting the R5, I think the R5 would absolutely be a great purchase. It is, from what I've done thus far, and I'm going to continue to test the hell out of this thing, from everything thus far, the R5 is just an amazing stills camera. And I think if Canon would have marketed more to the stills and not so much the video aspects, I think people would be praising the hell out of this camera right now. It is a shame that it's being overshadowed by the overheating stuff, but it is what it is. But again, if you are a stills shooter, I cannot recommend this camera enough. It is an amazing camera. Now, obviously I haven't used the R6. I'm not special enough to have Canon sending me any one of those. And let me just say, I buy these things with my own money. I'm a nobody in the Canon world. They have no clue who I am. So I'm not getting anything for free. I'm damn sure not sponsored by them. So, you know, I don't know how the R6 will compare. If the R6 can match a lot of the way that this functions, which I know it has a lot of the same things in it, then I think the R6 will be a hell of a value of a camera. If the autofocus functions as well and the IBIS is good, I'm sure the image quality will be a little less than the R5, but probably still acceptable. Then I think the R6 is going to be a phenomenal camera as well. So, you know, either way, I think you probably can't go wrong. I think both of these cameras are going to be home runs for Canon, at least from the photography side of it. They are fantastic. I really can't say that enough. So, you know, hopefully this was helpful. Again, I am going to do a lot more testing. I just wanted to do some initial testing and get some thoughts out there, because I know us stills photographers aren't really getting much right now. So I wanted to give us something to have. I'm definitely going to do a lot more. If there's anything in particular from a stills perspective that you would like me to test, please drop those down in the comments and I'll do my best to do that. Keep in mind, I don't have any connects. I don't have anybody sending me stuff. You know, I don't have an Atomos. Otherwise, I would have recorded my screen when I was doing the autofocus stuff. But, you know, I don't have all those things because I don't use them. And as much as I enjoy doing YouTube videos, I'm not going to spend my own money to go rent or buy this stuff just to be able to make these videos. But if there's something that you want me to test, or if there's something that you want to see or something you want to know, if I can do that for you, I most certainly will. If I can't, I can't. It is what it is. So yeah, there's that R5, great camera. I love it. I'm glad I have it. I'm getting ready to go out and shoot with it right now. So hopefully that was helpful. As always, continue to stay safe, stay healthy. And until next time, take care.